When someone lies, they can't hide everything. Their language, voice, face, and even their breath all betray them. Truth doesn't disappear, it merely changes form. This is one of the most chilling lines from Spatially, a method for recognizing deception. The book was penned by 3 former interrogators who served in American intelligence agencies. But beneath the guise of a guide to detecting lies, this work is a profound lesson about humanity, where deceit isn't viewed as a sin, but as a survival reflex. Through years of work, those who sat across from criminals, spies, politicians, and businesspeople discovered a singular truth: no one is entirely honest. People lie not only to hide evil, but sometimes to be loved, to save face, to escape fear. The book doesn't force us to become detectives, but to look within ourselves. It makes us realize that even in a casual nod or a polite smile, traces of deceit often lurk. What sets Spatially apart isn't its techniques, but its attitude of observing without judgment. Those who have interrogated thousands of liars understand that truth cannot be forced. It only reveals itself when people no longer have a reason to conceal it. Thus, the book teaches us how to listen between the lines, how to read a breath instead of words, and most importantly, how to maintain a calm mind when confronted with falsehood. And that's where the questions begin to resonate. If deceit is a human instinct, can any of us truly live with absolute honesty? If every smile can be a mask, what can we still believe in? And if we learn to recognize deception in others, do we have the courage to recognize it within ourselves? Spatially isn't just a book about skills, it's a mirror reflecting what humans try to hide. Because sometimes, the hardest thing to detect isn't someone else's lie, but the gentle lie we whisper to ourselves every day. The gloomy afternoon of May 11, 2001. Smoke and dust still billowed from the ruins of the Twin Towers in Washington. In a room not far from the Pentagon, those who had sworn to live for the country's secrets sat before maps, eyes red from lack of sleep. Amidst that chaos, these intelligence agents had one task: to find the truth amidst a whirlwind of words and panic. They weren't allowed to trust emotions, they were only allowed to trust signs. It was from that world that those who had faced thousands of different faces criminals, spies, politicians, traitors distilled a method to hear what was unspoken and see what was unacknowledged. They learned to look at eyes that avoided contact, at a blink that was one beat too slow, at evasive and meaningless answers. They understood that in every lie, there's always a distorted seed of truth, and in every truth, there's a gap that the liar exploits. One morning in the Middle East, Phil, one of those who lived by the intuition of an interrogator, was assigned to re-verify a long-standing agency source. The source's codename was Omar. 20 years of loyalty, 20 years of work without a blemish. Phil believed that meeting was just a formality. But when the question was posed, the air in the room suddenly solidified. "Have you ever worked for anyone other than us?" Phil asked, his voice as normal as it had been hundreds of times before. Omar slowly looked up, his gaze unfixed, and asked in return, "May I pray?" In that instant, Phil's world wavered for a fraction of a second. Every logical urge to believe in the good blinded him. He tried to tell himself that perhaps the man simply wanted to face Mecca. But in this profession, every unusual action is the language of deceit. When Omar spread his prayer rug and knelt, Phil clearly felt one thing: truth never needs ritual. After the prayer, Phil repeated the same question. Omar fell silent, then a small movement in his hand betrayed him. "Why do you ask that? Is something wrong?" Omar said, his voice trembling slightly. That's when Phil understood that the desire to believe is the most dangerous enemy. He pushed his emotions aside, began to probe deeper, layer by layer, detail by trivial detail. And then, like a thread unraveling from a spool, Omar broke down. "I've been working for them for 20 years. 20 years, that much time for deceit to fester within an organization designed to detect it." Phil understood that the terrifying thing wasn't Omar's skill at concealment, but that everyone wanted asterisk to believe he was honest. Truth isn't killed by the liar, but by the listener's eagerness to hear what they hope for. From that, he drew a harsh conclusion. People don't fear deceit, they fear doubt. A person can deceive the entire world as long as they make others feel comfortable. Phil realized he had almost become part of that deception, simply because he wanted to think he was astute enough. After that night, he began to gather every detail from hundreds of past interrogations. He found a common denominator. Every lie leaves a scratch on a person's natural reactions. A fleeting glance, a pause too short, a question in place of an answer, all were codes. From countless memories, he and his colleagues created a new approach, a model to decipher deceit using the very structure of speech and behavior. But before discussing the method, there was something they had to confront: their own psychology. Because the first enemy of a truth seeker isn't external, but within the reluctance to call someone a liar. Humans are taught from childhood that lying is wrong, so when faced with deceit, they don't want to admit it exists. They make excuses, they rationalize for others, to preserve a fragile shred of trust. But in the real world, honesty isn't a default, it's a choice. Every time we blindly believe, we grant others the power to conceal. Phil once said, "To see deceit, one must learn to live in the uncomfortable zone of doubt." That statement became the philosophy of truth hunters, because no one can learn to read people if they still fear losing faith in humanity. As he left the room where Omar had just confessed, the first rays of dawn broke over the Middle Eastern horizon. Light streamed through the window, illuminating the prayer rug still on the floor. Phil stood silently, knowing what he had just witnessed was more than just a betrayal. It was the moment one realizes truth is always present, we just haven't been brave enough to look it straight in the eye. From that experience, he began to rebuild his entire understanding of deceit. No longer simple prejudices like, if someone looks to the left, they're lying, or if they stutter, they're guilty. The human world is far more complex. Deceit has no fixed face, but it always leaves traces in the heartbeat, in the gaze, in the way we try to persuade others instead of simply stating the truth. And when Phil sent his report to Langley, no one could believe what he had written. The entire intelligence system had been manipulated by one person for 2 decades. Not because technology failed, but because human psychology lost. They didn't want to believe that someone they had praised was a traitor. Phil understood. We don't lose because we are deceived, but because we refuse to accept that we can be deceived. From that day, he began to draw the first lines of the map called Spatially, a map that leads not to treasure, but to awareness. On that map, there is no compass other than the ability to see the smallest reactions when people confront the truth. He wrote in his notebook a single line: "To find a liar, one must first learn to silence one's own emotions." That was the first step into the land of those who live with shadows, where truth only reveals itself to those brave enough not to believe what they want to believe. After the Omar incident, what haunted Phil most wasn't the betrayal itself, but how an entire organization could witness deceit and still not recognize it. He began to realize that deceit lies not only with the liar but also within the mind of the listener. People often carry a naive belief that most of the world is honest, that if someone looks us straight in the eye and says, "I didn't do it," they must be telling the truth. But that is the first illusion. Over hundreds of subsequent interviews, Phil and his colleagues identified invisible barriers that cause people to consistently fail at detecting deceit. The first barrier is the belief that people won't lie to them. Society is built on the assumption that honesty is the foundation of morality, so when someone breaks that rule, we react not with reason but with emotion. We become confused, defensive, and try to rationalize for them. That's why successful liars don't need to be overly intelligent. They just need to understand humanity's desire to believe. The second barrier is the reliance on behavioral myths. How many times have we heard someone say, "If he glances away, he's definitely hiding something"? Such beliefs are understandable but dangerous because they make us rely on stereotypes instead of observing reality. A person might cross their arms because they're cold, not because they're defensive. A liar might smile calmly, not because they're innocent, but because they know a smile lowers others' guard. In the real world, body language isn't a sign, it's data. And only context allows us to read that data correctly. The third barrier lies in humanity's own communication weaknesses. Most of us listen only to reply, not to understand. When someone speaks, we don't truly listen to their words, we just wait for our turn to react. Furthermore, over 60% of communication is nonverbal glances, gestures, pauses, yet most of us have never been taught how to read them. Thus, when trying to detect deceit, we are blind in the very language we use every day. The final and most dangerous barrier is bias. Humans cannot separate themselves from emotion. If we like someone, we tend to believe them. If we dislike someone, we readily conclude they are lying. In an investigation, this emotion is a double-edged sword. Phil recounted a story. a 13-year-old girl in California accused the leader of a satanic cult of abusing dozens of children. Everyone believed the girl because no one wanted to doubt a trembling child recounting horrors. But when Michael Flake, Phil's colleague, sat down and asked questions according to protocol, he noticed small signs: pauses out of rhythm, evasive answers, excessive repetition of details. Finally, the girl admitted she had fabricated everything. The entire community was stunned. The power of bias makes people believe what makes them feel comfortable, not what is true. Another time, Susan, a woman who worked in psychological interrogations for the CIA, met a job applicant named Mary. Before the interview, Susan learned Mary had cancer. Part of her felt compassion, but professional experience kept her calm. With a few precise questions, Susan realized Mary was not sick at all. She was faking cancer to gain sympathy and keep her job at a club after her parents, who had just died, could no longer support her. Deceit isn't just to hide mistakes, it's also born to elicit sympathy. Phil often said, "If we can't control our emotions, deceit will control us." In his years of work, he recognized another form of error: generalized judgment. When we meet someone, we unconsciously register hundreds of signals: their voice, gait, facial expression, clothing, how they look. Then we combine them into a vague conclusion: I feel this person is honest. But that feeling is a product of information overload, not evidence. It's like trying to drink from a fire hose. There's so much that nothing is retained. To detect deceit, one must learn to filter out the noise. Their real-life stories weren't limited to spies or criminals. Once, Susan went on vacation in Jamaica with her daughter and a friend. When a large sum of money disappeared from their rented house, she was advised not to bother looking because Jamaicans would never admit to stealing. But Susan still tried. She asked the housekeeper, Betty, a simple question: "Did you take the money?" Betty stepped back, bumped into a cupboard, and said, "I always take care of your daughter." An evasive answer. Susan pressed further. "What if someone said they saw you opening my handbag?" Betty fell silent, her eyes avoiding contact. Finally, when Susan asked what she had done with the money, Betty sighed and pulled a wad of cash from inside her shirt. In that prolonged silence, Susan understood one thing: deceit doesn't need a reason, it only needs an opportunity. From then on, their team established the first principle: eliminate the desire to believe. Every process of detecting falsehood begins not with a question, but by setting aside one's own biases. There is no good, no evil, only reaction. The honest person and the liar both breathe the same rhythm, but how they react to pressure is different. And perhaps the most important thing they realized after thousands of hours of interviews is that people don't act logically. An intellectual can tremble at a simple question, while a foolish person can be as calm as a stone. Behavior doesn't follow reason. It reflects the chaos between survival instinct and the fear of exposure. Therefore, to understand people, one cannot rely solely on logic, but must learn to hear the voice of tension in every second of their reaction. At the end of each investigation, Phil would often jot down a short sentence in his notebook: "Never believe that others won't lie, because even you yourself have lied." He knew that deceit isn't a human flaw, but a self-preservation instinct, and thus, detecting it cannot rely on morality, but on observation. That insight paved the way for the next step: building a method that could decipher deceit like a language. But before reaching the techniques, they needed a principle. Only when we accept that we can be deceived can we truly see the one deceiving us. And that's when the journey to find the Spatially model began to take shape from the chaos of emotions, prejudices, and blind faith that humanity has carried for thousands of years. From hundreds of interviews, thousands of fleeting glances and gestures, a model gradually formed in Phil's mind. He understood that if one could measure the body's reactions to a question, one could reach the door where truth was hidden. But what he found wasn't in machines, but in timing and behavioral clusters. Two seemingly minor rules that helped people like him read what others couldn't. Phil had worked for years in the agency's security unit, holding hundreds of charts of breath rates, heart rates, and sweat responses of those being interrogated. Lie detectors don't actually detect lies, they only measure the body's biological response to mental stress. He asked himself, if humans could do the same with their eyes and ears, observing and listening in a few short seconds, could they achieve similar results without equipment? That question became the foundation of the method he and his team called the reflexive behavior model. They discovered that every genuine reaction appears within the first 5 seconds after a question is asked. After that mark, the brain has had time to rationalize or construct a facade. Therefore, the first rule is asterisk timing asterisk. Whenever a question is posed, the observer must look and listen simultaneously within that 5-second window before the other person's brain can build a cover. The second rule is cluster asterisk. A single sign is never enough. A glance away, a quick breath, or a repeated phrase could just be random. But when 2 or more signals appear at the same time, an evasive gaze coupled with an avoidance answer, or a false smile with a change in voice, that is a cluster, and a cluster is the language of deceit. This method is completely different from how people usually think. It doesn't claim someone is lying, it simply points to where to dig deeper. Like a doctor finding a small tumor in an X-ray film, the investigator doesn't cut out the entire body, but focuses on the point of suspicion. Detecting deceit isn't hunting for guilt, it's pinpointing the truth. In internal training sessions, Phil would often tell newcomers, when asking, listen as if you know nothing, but look as if you're seeing a map of their mind. He recounted a story about a man being interviewed for a sensitive job. When asked if there was anything else he should know that hadn't been mentioned, the man paused briefly, then asked back, "What do you mean? What could be a concern?" That reflexive question was the first explosion point within 5 seconds. Just a few sentences later, the man confessed to having drugged his wife's wine to satisfy a perverse desire. It all started with a tiny off-rhythm moment. Phil always emphasized that the most powerful tool isn't complex questions, but repeating simple questions until the layers of defense crumble. A liar must constantly construct a story, while an honest person only needs to remember the truth. Therefore, the more thoroughly you ask, the more contradictory the liar becomes. But there's another, greater paradox, what Phil called the paradox of deceit. To find the truth, sometimes you have to learn to ignore honest behavior. Because the best liars aren't those who know how to hide, but those who know how to display truths to distract. One day, an employee suspected of theft entered Phil's office, his face calm, eyes clear. When he heard the accusation, he didn't react with anger, nor did he avoid the gaze. Instead, he smiled and said, "I want to show you my car trunk. It's full of Bibles. I donate them to church every week." Phil understood immediately. When people try to prove their innocence with unrelated things, they are building a shield of truth. In that trunk, there indeed were Bibles. And that's what made the story even more dangerous. Truth is never proof of innocence. It's merely a tool if placed correctly. Another example further clarifies this paradox. A middle-aged man was accused of cheating on his medical school entrance exam. When he met Michael Flake, Phil's colleague, he brought an photo album. Before being asked, he opened the album, showing pictures of his ancestral palace, photos with famous politicians, commendations for his family background. Each photo was a fragment of truth, but all were a smokescreen. When the interview began, after just a few questions, the polygraph drew violent curves. He had not only cheated, but had preloaded all the answers online. Phil said that the moment the man opened the album was when he incriminated himself. Because honest people don't need to prove their character, they just need to speak the truth. These cases show the paradoxical but obvious fact that people can use truth to conceal deceit. They flaunt their goodness to soothe suspicion, invoke faith to avoid questioning. When truth is used as a cover, it becomes a tool of deception. After many years, their model spread throughout intelligence and law enforcement agencies. But its creators always reminded, this is not the art of accusation, but the art of listening to what others inadvertently reveal. This method requires the observer to become still, discarding both prejudice and emotion. They must stand on the boundary of suspicion without falling into judgment. Once, when Phil was training a group of new officers, he ended the session with a statement that would later be considered the philosophy of the profession. If one of you is working for the enemy, remember that he will be discovered not because we are smarter, but because deceit cannot exist forever when we know where to look for it. After that statement, one of the trainees, who had taught at the agency's training school, was arrested for spying for another country. He had smiled and nodded when Phil spoke. Truth isn't hidden in promises, but in the way people are silent. In the world of interrogations, sometimes the truth isn't in the answer, but in the short breath between two words. Language is humanity's most sophisticated mask, and also the tool liars use to ensnare themselves. After thousands of interviews, I realized that no words are completely harmless. Every answer, whether short or long, is a piece of a mental map. When people are asked a question, the brain reacts in a fraction of a second, choosing between truth, which can be dangerous, and a lie, which can save them. In that moment of reflex, the voice distorts, the rhythm trembles, and traces are left behind. Within the first 5 seconds after a question, the lie begins to reveal itself. That is the brief window where the truth hasn't yet been distorted. In a training session for security forces, I asked a young officer, "Have you ever noticed people answering a question with another question?" He smiled and said, "I see it all the time, but I thought it was just a habit." In reality, that is one of the typical linguistic indicators of deceit. When surprised, liars need time to construct a script. A reverse question is a way to prolong that moment. Listen again to these familiar reactions. Why would I lie? Do you think I'm that kind of person? What would I gain if I did that? On the surface, it sounds confident, but it's actually defensive. Honest people answer directly, liars attack the question. Another, more sophisticated form is the persuasive answer, or segment. The liar doesn't say, "I didn't do it," but rather, "I am an honest person. I swear to God, I am a patriot. I would never betray." They use morality to cover up their actions. And when two or more persuasive statements appear consecutively, we have what's called a cluster of deceit signals. The more someone tries to prove themselves, the more it shows something is hidden. I once participated in an investigation where the interrogated person continuously spoke about his family, his trustworthiness, his good past everything except the question asked. He didn't realize that his rambling was evidence of his inner fear. Honest people just need to answer, while liars have to act, and acting is always more exhausting than living truthfully. In my years working at the agency, I recorded dozens of examples of how words betray their owner. A politician, when asked about missing funds, instead of saying, "I'm not involved," replied, "I've dedicated my entire life to this country." A father, when suspected of abusing his daughter, instead of answering, "I didn't do it," said, "I love my child more than anyone." When simple truth is replaced by complex persuasion, we should stop and listen. The deeper I delved, the more I found that deceit has its own sound. It's not in the content, but in the rhythm. Liars often add unnecessary details, creating a sense of truth through redundancy. When asked, "Were you home last night?" they don't say yes or no, but "I came home, had dinner with my wife, watched TV, and went to bed early." The longer the answer, the greater the potential for concealment. Sometimes a lie makes no sound at all. It's just a pause, a silence that lasts too long. When the brain has to choose between truth and falsehood, silence is the buffer zone. I remember an incident where I asked a man about a secret meeting. He looked down at the table, subtly took a breath, and was silent for exactly 3 seconds. Those 3 seconds felt longer than the entire interrogation. Then he replied, "I don't remember anything." Sudden forgetfulness is always a close friend of deceit. But not all silence implies guilt. Therefore, the rule remains unchanged. We only consider them signals when they form a cluster, appearing simultaneously within the first 5 seconds. A distracting remark, a deep sigh, a small movement of the lip-saw, when alone, can be meaningless, but when they appear together, they form a language. Interestingly, liars often try to appear overly calm. They know that trembling is easily suspicious, so they put on a facade of confidence, sometimes even coldness. In press conferences, we often see people facing serious accusations smiling, speaking slowly, as if nothing is happening. That's a compensatory reaction. When there's internal turmoil, the exterior must remain steady. But the body always finds a way to betray. A slightly hoarse voice, dry lips, touching the neck, or a quick breath at the end of a sentence no lie can maintain a steady breathing rhythm. Once I asked a trainee, "What, in your opinion, is a perfect lie?" He paused for a moment and replied, "When the listener believes it absolutely." I nodded and said, "No, it's when the listener doesn't need to believe it." A perfect lie isn't perfect because it's clever, but because the listener doesn't want to verify it. Truth doesn't die from being denied. It dies when no one seeks it anymore. Language is the liar's weapon, but also the evidence against them. Every syllable, every reflex carries the imprint of their psychology. When people speak, they don't just utter sounds, they reveal a map of their emotions. Honest people speak to explain, liars speak to survive. And that difference, however subtle, still echoes in the ears of those who know how to listen. After every interview, I ask myself, what percentage of what we hear daily is true? Perhaps less than we imagine. Because deceit doesn't only exist in the interrogation room, it seeps into every conversation, every apology, every promise. We live in a world where truth must fight for every breath against justifications. At the end of a training session, I often remind students, don't listen to what people say. Listen to how they say it, how they inhale before answering, how they choose their words, how they emphasize. All are mirrors reflecting the fear of being exposed. And if you are patient enough to listen, you will find that every lie has its own sound. A faint sound of insecurity trying to feign tranquility. Not all lies are crude. Some are tailored like a perfectly fitted coat, sewn with threads of truth. The most sophisticated liars never create an entirely false world. They only distort reality enough to make it believable. It's the truthful part within the lie that ensnares the listener. In countless investigations I've witnessed, the half-truth, half-lie is always the most dangerous kind. Imagine someone suspected of embezzlement. He recounts his work process, detailing meetings, figures, related colleagues, all true. But he omits one small detail, his approval of the final payment to himself. Truth is used as a foundation for the lie, like mixing poison into a glass of clear water. The listener is drawn into the logical structure, forgetting that one small piece can spoil the entire picture. A classic example I always remember is the story of Jeffrey Skilling, CEO of Enron. In the early days of the scandal, Skilling appeared before the public with a confident demeanor, a calm voice, constantly emphasizing the company's transparency. When asked by a journalist if he had deceived shareholders, he simply replied, "No." Just a few seconds later, when someone asked a more piercing question, "Then why do your financial reports contradict the actual data?" Skilling exploded, threw the microphone, and yelled, "You're an asshole." In that moment, all layers of composure crumbled. A liar's fury is always a reaction when they are cornered. Anger is a tactic. When exposed, liars understand that attack is the only way to regain control. If they frighten the interrogator, they can slow down the questioning process. Some curse, some cry, some feign such offense that they cannot continue. But beneath that layer of emotion, you will see raw fear of exposure, more revealing than any evidence. In another interview, I asked a woman suspected of defrauding a charity fund, "Have you ever used organization money for personal purposes?" She looked at me, agitated, and said, "Do you think I'm that kind of person?" The statement was uttered quickly and forcefully, tinged with anger, but in her eyes I saw a flicker of panic, like a flash of fear just unmasked. She didn't answer the question, she attacked the questioner. It's an ancient reflex of the survival instinct. When you can't escape, you scream to scare off your predator. Anger comes in many forms. Sometimes it hides under a layer of sarcasm. Someone might respond with a sneer, saying things like, "Oh my God, it's ridiculous that you'd think I did that." That laughter isn't joy, but a thin layer of bone covering anxiety. Some choose to feign offense, saying, "I can't believe you'd ask me that." Some choose silence, staring straight ahead to become a stone statue. But in all these reactions, the common thread is they want to shift the focus away from the original question. I used to teach students that when confronted with anger, don't respond with emotion. Let silence do the work, because in a fit of rage, the lie begins to fracture. When people yell, they lose control of their rhythm, and in that chaos, the truth often slips out through the cracks in their voice. Not everyone who gets angry is lying, but in the context of questioning, anger is not the natural reaction of an honest person. Innocent people are usually confused, anxious, or even sad. They want to be understood. Guilty people want to attack because they fear understanding means exposure. Some choose not anger, but excessive politeness. A man once investigated for financial fraud, upon entering the interview room, bowed and smiled, saying, "Thank you for your valuable time. It's an honor to meet you." Every sentence was perfect, not a single beat off. But that smoothness was precisely the problem. Real people are rarely perfect, and when someone reveals not even a single natural flaw, we should suspect they are acting. I've seen liars cry real tears, real trembling. But when pressed deeper, their answers became fragmented, evasive, and contradictory details emerged. Real emotion cannot save false content. People might cry out of shame, or because they've been caught, not because they're innocent. One of the biggest lessons I learned is that strong emotion is never proof of honesty. They are merely signals of the level of stress, and liars, while trying to appear honest, often push themselves into a state of losing control. There's another phenomenon I call defensive ritual. When asked, many people begin to justify themselves by pulling others into the story. Doesn't everyone do that? Everyone's like that. They want to dissolve their guilt into the collective to normalize their behavior. But truth doesn't need allies, only lies seek shared responsibility to feel safe. After many years, I recognized a rule: the more someone tries to make you believe, the more suspicious they are. Because honest people don't need to persuade, they just need to be heard. And liars, no matter how much they say, still fear exposure deep down. That fear is the fire that burns through the act, and also the light that helps us see them more clearly. I still remember the feeling after an interview with a man who committed a crime but denied it to the end. He spoke for 40 minutes in a steady voice with a firm gaze. As he stood to leave, he said, "I hope you believe me." I simply replied, "I don't need to believe you, I just need to understand you." Because truth doesn't need belief, it only needs observation. The most dangerous lies don't make us angry, they move us. They don't shout, they soothe like gentle words of comfort. They give us what we want to hear, making us feel the world is orderly and logical. That's when people stop doubting, and deceit wins. When night falls after a long interrogation, I often think, perhaps in each person, there's a small part that wants to be believed, even if they know they don't deserve it. That part makes us lie and also makes us believe other liars. Truth and deceit are not opposites. They are just two ways people fight fear. Language can be controlled, voices can be adjusted, but the body cannot. When words and emotions conflict, the body is always the most loyal betrayer. Deceit is not only heard. It can be seen, and sometimes a gaze speaks more than 1,000 justifications. In interviews, I always pay attention to the moment people hear a question before they answer. A very small movement often flashes across. The corner of the mouth twitches, the shoulders slightly retract, a dry swallow, or a hand changes position. That is the body's language negotiating with the truth. These reactions appear before the brain has time to construct a lie because they are instincts that cannot be faked. A person can learn to smile, but they cannot learn to make that smile align with their eyes. The misalignment between words and body, the nonverbal disconnect, is where deceit leaves its traces. When the mouth says, "I'm fine," but the throat chokes. When they say, "I'm not scared," but their fingers clench, we are seeing the truth that words try to hide. I remember a famous case. When a man appeared in public to deny guilt, he smiled throughout the session, his voice gentle, his demeanor calm. But every time the victim's name was mentioned, his hands contracted, his fingers drummed on the table, his breathing changed. He controlled his words, but he couldn't control his body reacting to true emotions. It was these small changes that drew specialists' attention and expanded the investigation. And eventually, the lie was exposed. In training sessions, I always say, look for signs that appear immediately after the question. If we ask, "Did you take that money?" and the person immediately scratches their neck, licks their lips, looks down, then smiles, it's not a coincidence. The body doesn't understand strategy. It only reacts to tension, and tension is the shadow of deceit. Once in a political case, I asked an official, "Have you ever received gifts from that company?" He immediately replied, "Never." But as he spoke, his hands clasped on the table, his thumbs rubbing vigorously together, a self-soothing gesture, an unconscious action of someone fighting the fear of being discovered. When I repeated the question, his eyes shifted to the left, then he smiled. "You're very thorough." Deceit cannot be hidden behind a smile. A smile is a thin curtain, and facial muscles always tremble slightly when strained to maintain composure. People often think that simply practicing expressions is enough to deceive others, but the body is an orchestra that cannot be directed by words alone. When the mind is uneasy, all micro-muscles vibrate to the rhythm of anxiety. A liar might look you straight in the eye, but their pupils will constrict. They might sit still, but their feet will tap lightly. These vibrations are so small they are hard to see. But when we learn to observe, they resonate like subtle signals of truth. Not just eyes or hands, breathing is also a language. Honest people breathe steadily and deeply. Liars often hold their breath when a question hits a nerve. In that moment, the body seems to stop because the brain is stuck between two exits. I once saw a man hold the same posture for several seconds without blinking, then exhale with a long sigh. Immediately after, he said, "I don't remember." That statement sounded harmless, but his body had already spoken. Another case is the distraction reaction through gestures. When they don't want to answer, liars will move to divert attention, stroking their hair, adjusting their chair, looking around, or lightly smiling. These actions are not only to feign calmness, but to self-soothe. People touch their face, neck, or arms when stressed because it's an instinctive self-comfort. When we see someone constantly touching the area around their mouth while denying something, we should note that the hand is trying to soothe the heart that words are hurting. However, observing the body is not to condemn. A person might bite their lip out of anxiety, not because they are lying. Therefore, as I once taught, never trust a single sign. Only when signs gather into a cluster and appear within the first 5 seconds do we have reason to suspect. That is the immutable law of truth. I still remember a late-night interrogation, the lamplight casting shadows on the interrogated man's face. When I asked, "Are you hiding anyone in your house?" he said no, his voice steady, his eyes not avoiding mine. But as he spoke, his shoulders rose as if preparing to absorb a blow. That gesture lasted only half a second, but it was enough. After checking, just as my intuition told me, someone was hiding in the basement. The body always speaks what the mind cannot deny in time. Many people think lying is a skill, but in reality, it's a burden. Liars have to control too many things at once: voice, words, facial expressions, hands, breath. Each slight deviation can tear the curtain. Honest people, conversely, just need to exist. They don't need to control. Therefore, the longer it goes on, the more exhausted the liar becomes, and truth always has greater endurance than deceit. Once I stood before a mirror and tried to lie to myself. I'm not tired. My lips moved, my voice deepened, but my eyes remained heavy. I realized one thing: the first lie humans learn is to lie to themselves. We perform for ourselves, believing what is more comfortable. And that's why professional liars often end up believing the stories they create. Even when forced, the body has its limits. It cannot withstand the pressure of artificiality for too long. Sweat, subtle trembling, shortened breaths all will return. In the last class I taught, I told my students, don't try to become someone who can read others. Become someone who understands yourself. Because only when we recognize the signs of deceit within ourselves, the evasive blink, the forced smile when having to say what the heart doesn't want, can we truly see them in others. Deceit can change its voice, change its face, but it can never change the respiration rhythm of fear when people tremble before the truth. Without words, we still hear the faint breath of conscience. There's a truth few pay attention to. Sometimes we don't detect a lie not because the other person is too clever, but because we asked the wrong question. Truth never steps out on its own if it's not forced to confront, and the only tool to do that is the question. In the world of truth hunters, asking isn't about finding an answer, it's about creating a reaction. I once stood in front of a training class for people learning to detect deception. A young officer asked, "Does all this really work?" I smiled because that very question contained its own answer. The way he asked, the way his eyes looked, the way his shoulders leaned forward all showed he wanted to believe, but was still hesitant. Every question reveals the questioner, and every answer reveals the respondent. In this profession, I learned that there are no harmless questions. Some questions are like mirrors, reflecting the listener's own anxiety. And some questions are like a knife, stabbing into their deepest fears. Ask the wrong question, and you get a perfect lie. Ask the right question, and you just have to wait for their body and voice to react within the first 5 seconds. One of the techniques I often use is called the bait question. It's like how a hunter throws a small stone into the water to see if a fish moves. I don't need the other person to confess. I just need to see their reaction to a possibility. For example, when suspecting an employee of embezzlement, instead of asking, "Did you take the money?" I say, "If someone in the team did that, who do you think it would be?" The initial reaction, the glance, the twisted smile, the clenching of hands says it all. The verbal answer isn't important. What's important is the biological reflex when the mind is triggered. The second technique is the assumption question. Assume the other person has already done something, then observe how they handle that assumption. When I ask, "Have you ever thought that was wrong?" an honest person will be surprised. A liar will try to justify themselves even before being accused. because deceit cannot endure silence. It needs to be justified, adorned with reasons. An effective question isn't a clever question. It's a question that doesn't give the person being asked time to act. Therefore, in every interview, I always maintain a neutral tone, no accusation, no suspicion, no pretense of knowing more than them. A neutral voice makes the other person think they are still safe, and it is in that safety that they become careless. Fear only begins when they believe they haven't been discovered. I remember an investigation involving a nanny. The parents suspected she harmed their child but had no proof. When I met her, I didn't ask, "Did you hurt the child?" But rather, "When you look after the baby, does the baby ever make you tired?" She gave a forced laugh and said, "Of course not, the baby is very well behaved." But immediately after, she blinked faster than usual and gently bit her lip. In those 5 seconds, I saw a different story hidden behind the smile. She didn't lie with words, she lied by avoiding telling the truth. A skillful question can make deceit reveal itself without an accusation. Questions also have levels. There are closed questions, requiring a yes or no answer, and open questions, forcing the person to tell a story. Closed questions are used to create pressure. Open questions are used to observe how they construct their narrative. If they recount too many details, adding parts no one asked for, that's a sign of a prepared script. Honest people recount from memory, while liars recount from a script. When forced to improvise, the brain will reveal traces of the fear of making mistakes. Sometimes I don't ask anything at all, I let silence do the work. Silence makes liars restless. They fear the void, so they rush to fill it with words. And it's in those superfluous words that the truth is dragged out of its hiding place. I call that the question of silence. It makes no sound, but it has more power than any interrogation. The questioner must also learn not to fall into their own trap. When we want to accuse, our voice, eyes, and posture will unconsciously betray our intention. Liars will use that to build a reactive script. Therefore, the art of questioning is the art of self-control. To see deceit, one must first conceal suspicion within oneself. One morning in the agency's conference room, an officer asked me, "Does this method ever fail?" I replied, "It doesn't fail. Only the person using it forgets that the question isn't meant to find an answer, but to observe a reaction. The wrong question turns a smart person into a blind one. The right question turns silence into evidence." And finally, the most important thing I learned is that truth is never forced. It is only brought out. A well-timed question can melt the ice between two people, making the other person feel safe enough that they themselves want to be freed. At that point, tactics are no longer needed. Only genuine listening, because sometimes it's the feeling of being understood that makes people tell the truth. Truth seekers don't need to shout to find the truth. They just need to know how to ask questions that make the truth want to emerge on its own. In this profession, nothing is more exhausting than facing a professional liar. Some people have lived with deceit for so long that they themselves believe the stories they concocted. At that point, the truth is no longer hidden, it has been replaced. And the truth seeker's job isn't to force a confession, but to see the cracks in the wall they built themselves. I've met many such people, calm, sharp, every gaze calculated. They are what we call adaptive liars, those who have trained their physical reflexes to near perfection. They can maintain a steady breathing rhythm, no trembling hands, no excessive blinking. For them, lying is a role they've memorized. But no matter how skillful, the body cannot precisely repeat a behavior over time. Therefore, what I observe isn't the moment itself, but the slight deviation of behavior over time. A smile delayed longer than the last time, a pause longer than usual. These seemingly harmless changes are invaluable clues. In an internal investigation, a high-ranking employee was suspected of leaking information. Each time he was questioned, he responded with the same voice, the same posture, almost perfectly to the point of being suspicious. I decided to change my approach. Instead of asking about his actions, I asked about his feelings. If someone in the team did that, how do you think they would feel? He tilted his head slightly, a small movement of his wrist. And then, in the next few seconds, he said a sentence that made me stop writing. I think they would feel relieved not to have to keep the secret anymore. It was then that I knew he had given himself away. Truth often hides not in the answer, but in how people imagine the emotions of others. But it's not only liars who make this job difficult. Truth seekers are also prone to making mistakes, especially when they are overconfident. The most dangerous trap isn't in the opponent, but in our own beliefs. Once we suspect someone, we start seeing every sign through the lens of suspicion. When we trust someone, we blind ourselves to warning signs. I call that the confirmation trap, the trap that makes investigators see only what they want to see. A glance becomes proof of guilt, a smile is interpreted as avoidance. And so, we stop observing. We are merely looking for reasons to be right. In a major case many years ago, a team of investigators failed because of this. They put absolute trust in the first witness, and thus every contradictory piece of evidence was ignored. When the truth was revealed, they realized they had been deceived not by a criminal, but by their own professional pride. The feeling of being right is the most dangerous enemy of the truth seeker. I once told my students, if you walk into a room with the belief that someone is lying, you've already lost. The best lie detectors are not the most suspicious people, but those capable of keeping their minds clear, observing without judging. That requires mental discipline, almost like meditation. Like a calm lake, only when it ripples do we truly see the clouds reflected above. In long interviews, sometimes we encounter people who know how to counterattack. They don't just deny, they attack the questioner. They say, "What right do you have to ask me that?" Or, "Are you trying to frame me?" Their anger is a defensive tool. When the investigator is drawn into emotion, they lose their rhythm of observation. I always remind myself, don't react, don't reply with words. Let them vent their anger. Because every time emotions flare up, their control weakens. Some choose a different approach. They tell a moving story. They talk about a difficult past, about being misunderstood, about the people they love, a story that softens the listener's heart. And in empathy, we easily forget our original goal. But I've learned that emotion is smoke, while truth is the glowing ember hidden beneath. If you only look at the smoke, you will get lost in the fog. I once asked a man suspected of stealing data, "Why do you think people suspect you?" He replied with a choked voice, "Because they're jealous of my success." Tears welled up in his eyes, but immediately after when I asked, "What if they find evidence on your computer?" He took a breath and replied, "I think they'll understand it was just a misunderstanding." The statement was pre-prepared. The emotion just now was a perfect opening act for the play. The longer I worked in this profession, the more I understood that no one can escape deceit. It's just a matter of what kind of deceit they choose. Some lie to escape. Some lie to survive. Some lie to protect someone else. But whatever the purpose, deceit always leaves traces in how people face questions about morality. When you ask someone, "Do you think that was wrong?" an honest person answers directly. A liar justifies it by circumstances. Truth sometimes refuses to appear not because it is weak, but because people are not brave enough to face it. Some have lied for so long that they fear if the truth is spoken, they will vanish with it. At that point, I no longer see them as criminals, but as people imprisoned in a jail they built themselves. And my job is not to break the lock, but to shine a light so they can see that the door was never locked. One evening, after finishing a long interrogation, I walked out of the room. Standing in the silent hallway, I understood that in this world, there are truths we can never hear in words. They lie in a glance, in someone's soft sigh, in the words, "I'm fine," while their hands tremble. And sometimes, knowing that the truth is there, even if it refuses to come out, is enough. After many years in this line of work, I realized something I hadn't understood when I was young. Deceit doesn't just exist in the interrogation room. It lives in every relationship, every social interaction, every moment people try to avoid pain. We think we're only hunting for others' lies, but the deeper we go, the more incredible things we discover. Most of the lies we face every day come from ourselves. I once asked a close friend, an exemplary father, "Why did you hide losing your job from your family for 2 months?" He was silent for a very long time, then replied, "Because I didn't want them to be disappointed." That was a lie born of love, born of the fear of someone wanting to maintain the trust of those he loved. But no matter how good the motive, every lie is still a distance between people. It prevents us from truly connecting. In my work, I meet people who lie to protect their status, avoid trouble, maintain an image. In love, some lie to avoid hurting others. In politics, some lie believing it's the only way to maintain order. But at its root, every lie stems from a fear. Fear of loss, fear of judgment, fear of seeing oneself exposed. When I lectured about spatially to different groups, police officers, journalists, managers, they often asked if they should apply this technique to everyday life. I always answered yes, but not to catch others' mistakes. Because if you only use it to suspect, you'll turn the world into a cold place where everyone becomes an object of judgment. The true goal of understanding deceit isn't detection, but learning to listen deeper, more subtly, more humanely. When observing human behavior, I noticed a paradoxical rule. The more someone tries to appear genuine, the more easily they expose their artificiality. Conversely, those who are silent, slow, often carry a raw truth that needs no display. In daily life, deceit isn't always a sin. Sometimes it's how people protect themselves from the harshness of the world. But if deceit becomes a habit, it makes people lose themselves, no longer knowing what is real. I once witnessed a mother lie to her son that his father was on a business trip, while the father had left forever. Each time the child asked, she told a different story, gentle and full of love. It was one of the most beautiful lies I've ever seen, and also the most heartbreaking, because I understood that when the child grew up, he would feel that this world was no longer trustworthy. Lies can be created out of love, but their consequence is always loneliness. When people live too long in a network of fabrications, they begin to forget what it feels like to tell the truth. Some people come to me not because they committed a crime, but because they no longer recognize their true selves. They say, "I've had to be strong for many years." And I reply, "No, you've only been deceiving yourself for many years." Because true strength doesn't come from hiding pain, but from daring to face it. The method I once used to read others, I later realized, could also be used to read myself. I started paying attention to my own reactions when I had to say something I didn't want to, when I hid my true feelings. Each time, I heard my heart beat faster, my breath short, my voice change pitch. I understood that even I, who had trained hundreds of specialists in deceit, was not immune. We all have a part of us that fears the truth. And only when we recognize that can we truly see deceit in others. In a final lecture, I told the class, "Don't use this skill to judge others. Use it to understand why people choose to lie. Because when you understand that, your heart will soften. You will no longer judge, but begin to empathize. Deceit is not only the enemy of truth, but also a part of human weakness." Understanding this, we will know how to use the skill of detecting deceit not as a weapon, but as a mirror reflecting humanity. I once asked a woman who had committed adultery, "Why didn't you tell your husband the truth?" She smiled sadly, "Because he loved the image of me, not the real me." That answer left me silent. Perhaps deceit isn't always an active choice, but sometimes a reaction from someone who isn't allowed to live authentically. The world often forces people to choose between truth and acceptance. And then, after all this, I understood that the truth seeker must ultimately look within themselves. Because no one can see through others unless they have looked deeply into the dark parts of their own being. When we are brave enough to admit that we too have lied, have been afraid, have evaded, then we can truly understand others without judgment. The day I left the agency, I stood before a mirror, looking at my face, a face that had reflected so many other faces. I asked myself if I was still lying about anything. Perhaps I was, but unlike before, I wasn't trying to deny it anymore. I accepted it as a part of being human, and it is in that acceptance that truth is born. Truth doesn't need to be exposed to exist, it only needs to be acknowledged, even in silence. Perhaps after closing this book, what remains with us isn't just the skill of analyzing gestures or identifying deceit, but a subtle shift in how we view people. Because spatially doesn't really teach us how to catch someone lying. It teaches us to listen more carefully, look more slowly, and empathize more deeply. We all grow up amidst countless masks: politeness, confidence, strength, even kindness. But sometimes, those masks are merely covers for fear, shame, or fragility. This book shows us that behind a lie isn't always malice, but often a soul trying to survive without being hurt. So, the best at seeing through deceit isn't the sharpest, but the most compassionate. The biggest lesson here is that truth doesn't need to be pursued with force. It needs to be awakened by a quiet presence. When we stop wanting to win every conversation, we can hear what others aren't saying. When we stop trying to read others, we truly understand them. This world isn't short on lies, but what suffocates it isn't deceit, but the fear of truth. We fear knowing because knowing means having to choose, forgive or leave, continue to trust or let go. That's why the hardest thing isn't detecting deceit, but daring to live honestly in a world that prefers pretense. The book also leaves a paradox. The more clearly you understand how others lie, the more you see the fragility within yourself. Every time you look in the mirror, you realize there are small things you're still hiding. You say, "I'm fine," while your heart is tired. You say, "It's okay," while the wound still bleeds. Perhaps all skills for identifying deceit are meaningless if we don't have the courage to look directly at the deceit within ourselves. So, what's more important? Knowing who is lying. Or knowing what you are avoiding? Do you dare to live a day without concealment, without embellishment, without twisting words, without trying to be liked, just to see if your true self is still accepted? And if the answer is not sure, then perhaps in that very moment, you have fully understood the message of this book. Because in the end, Spatially is not an interrogator's manual, but a mirror for someone learning to be honest not only with others, but first and foremost with oneself. When we dare to live truthfully, we no longer fear anyone's lies. When we understand the fear in others, we no longer need to expose them. And when we realize that deceit is also just a form of cry for help, we begin to look at people with softer eyes, where truth and compassion can coexist. The world doesn't need more lie detectors. It just needs more people quiet enough to listen, sincere enough not to need to lie anymore. And perhaps if each of us starts with ourselves, truth will no longer be something to be sought, but a way of life. Thank you for listening.